Your neighborhood is on fire. You call 911. You wait. You call again. Still nothing. You look out the window and understand something that changes you permanently. No one is on the way. That's not a hypothetical. That's what happened in 140 American cities across 20 states in the summer of 2020. According to Property Claim Services, the organization that has tracked civil disorder insurance data since 1950, the arson, looting, and vandalism produced between $1 and $2 billion in insured losses. The single most expensive episode of civil unrest in American history. It shattered the record set by the 1992 Rodney King riots. And that number only counts what was insured. 40% of small businesses carry no insurance at all. So when police pulled back, and in many cities they were ordered to, someone else had to make a decision. In Minneapolis, they climbed to the rooftops. In Kenosha, they stood in front of their businesses with AR-15s and flashlights. In St. Paul, they put themselves between a mob and a black-owned shop. They were not the National Guard. They weren't a militia flown in from somewhere else. They were neighbors. The media called them vigilantes. But before you accept that framing, ask yourself the one question nobody in a press room wants answered. If the government was doing its job, why were the neighbors on the roof? This isn't a story about 2020. This is a story about what will happen next time. And based on the numbers, there will be a next time. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project recorded nearly 20,000 demonstrations in the United States in 2025 alone. That's a 77% increase over 2024, and the highest total since 2020. The kindling is already stacked. So let's talk about what this costs you specifically. Your wallet first. Research on the 1992 Los Angeles riots found that the affected areas did not just suffer $1 billion in immediate damage. They lost an estimated $3.85 billion in taxable sales over the following decade. Property values in riot-hit neighborhoods lagged compared to unaffected areas for 30-plus years. The insurance check closes the file, but the neighborhood lives with that damage for a generation. The clock is already running in Minneapolis, it's running in Kenosha, and it's running in Portland. Second, your daily life. In Minneapolis, more than 1,300 buildings were damaged or destroyed. A 5-mile stretch of Lake Street, built largely by Black and immigrant families over decades, was gutted in a single night. Most of those business owners were uninsured or underinsured. They didn't get a bailout. They got a broom. Third, your freedom. Portland police response times to shots fired calls more than doubled during peak unrest in 2020, according to Georgetown Law Review published in 2021. In Chicago, the DEA declined to prosecute over 400 riot-related arrests. When the cost of destroying a neighborhood drops to zero, the destruction expands to fill the space. And here's the part that should land hardest. Kenosha, Wisconsin has a population under 100,000 people. It's not Chicago, it's not Portland. The riots found it anyway. Your town is one viral incident, one contested verdict, one national news cycle away from the same math. When that moment comes, the question isn't whether the government will protect you. The summer of 2020 already answered that. The question is whether you have a plan when the answer is no. But before I show you what actually happened on those streets, I'm going to give you the strongest possible version of the argument against armed civilian defense during a riot. Not the weak version, the strong one, the real one. Because if I strawman the other side, I'm no better than the outlets I'm criticizing. So here it is. Armed civilians in active riot situations are unvetted, untrained, and operating without rules of engagement or legal authority. A study cited by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace found that demonstrations with armed participants present are an estimated 6.5 times more likely to turn violent than unarmed ones. That's not spin, that's a data point. More armed strangers in a chaotic environment statistically produces more danger. The Kenosha Guard, a civilian Facebook group that organized armed patrols during the 2020 unrest, had over 5,000 signups before Facebook pulled the page down. 5,000 strangers, no vetting, no command structure, no unified rules of engagement, converging on a single city in active crisis. That's not a security force, that's a pressure cooker. And if you need a name to anchor the argument, the other side has one. Kyle Rittenhouse, 17 years old, drove across state lines from Antioch, Illinois. No established relationship with the community he showed up to protect. Got into a confrontation and 2 people died. That is what unorganized, unvetted, armed civilian response looks like when it goes wrong. The strongest version of their argument is this: trained, accountable, professional law enforcement is safer than armed freelancers. Strip away the politics and that statement is reasonable. It holds if the law enforcement actually shows up. In Minneapolis, police abandoned the 3rd Precinct entirely. Residents reported their streets were simply empty of any law enforcement presence. In Seattle, city officials ordered police out of 6 square blocks for weeks, a zone protesters named the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest, and law enforcement was told to stay out. The government did not fail to perform, it chose not to. Those are different things. And here's the move the media made that you need to understand. They took Kyle Rittenhouse, an unvetted teenager from out of state, and used him to discredit every organized, licensed, community-embedded neighborhood defender in the country. The multiracial rooftop patrol in Minneapolis, the 2 veterans standing watch outside their subdivision in Kenosha, the armed Black residents protecting a Black-owned shop in St. Paul, all of them painted with the same brush. That was not sloppy journalism. It was a deliberate editorial choice. Because if you keep those stories cleanly separated, organized local defenders versus a rogue teenager, the argument against armed civilian defense collapses entirely. Where organized, disciplined local patrols stood watch, the damage was dramatically lower. That story didn't make the 6 o'clock news. Why would it? It goes against the narrative. Let's go block by block through what the cameras didn't show you. Start with Minneapolis. When unrest escalated in May 2020, law enforcement withdrew from the 3rd Precinct. NPR documented the moment community members began organizing their own patrols, not because they wanted to, but because the streets were empty and fires were spreading. There wasn't anyone else. Chicago told a parallel story. Cook County State Attorney Kim Foxx declined to prosecute approximately 400 of the non-felony riot-related cases police brought to her office. The message that sent to the street was unambiguous. The cost of breaking the law, of looting, of destruction was functionally zero. You don't have to defund the police to remove deterrence. You just have to stop prosecuting the behavior you claim to oppose. When the deterrence disappears, someone has to fill that space. In 2020, ordinary people did. In Minneapolis, a community organization called Security Latinos de la Lake formed armed rooftop patrols along Lake Street corridor. These weren't strangers from the internet. These were business owners and neighbors who had watched the community begin to burn. The women organizing the patrol required verified carry licenses before anyone with a firearm took a position on the roof. No license, no rooftop. Organized, vetted, locally embedded. The block they protected was largely spared. In Kenosha, approximately 10 minutes from downtown, where $50 million in private property damage would ultimately be tallied, 2 armed residents stood at the entrance to their subdivision with AR-15s and flashlights. They stopped vehicles. They identified themselves. They reported 0 incidents. One of them, a resident named Gilbert, described it plainly. All we're doing is making sure the community can sleep fine and aren't worried about anything. No confrontations, no escalations. A neighborhood untouched while 40 businesses permanently shuttered blocks away. In St. Paul, armed Black residents went viral protecting a Black-owned business. not out-of-state militiamen, not strangers from a Facebook group, just neighbors exercising a constitutional right that gun control advocates claim to support in principle, but apparently not when the people doing it do not fit the preferred political narrative. Now, about Kyle Rittenhouse. The media needed him, not because his case was representative, it was not, but because it was useful. Take one unvetted teenager who drove in from another state with no community ties and no organized structure, and attach him permanently to the phrase armed civilian defender. That single case became the template for every news segment, every editorial, every policy argument against civilian neighborhood defense that followed. Here's what they buried. The Kenosha County Sheriff publicly called civilian defenders like a group of vigilantes. His own officers were simultaneously filmed on cell phone video thanking those same defenders and handing them bottles of water. The sheriff later said his officers were very wrong to do so, not because the defenders were dangerous, but because the optics were politically inconvenient. That's the tell. When the people in charge condemn publicly what they validate privately, you're watching a narrative being constructed in real time. So what do the numbers actually hide? The $1 to $2 billion figure gets repeated constantly. Here's what it doesn't capture. Property claim services measure only insured losses. According to research from the Foundation for Economic Education, roughly 75% of American small businesses are underinsured, and approximately 40% carry no commercial property insurance at all. Their losses don't appear in the headline number, they just disappear. The Lake Street Council in Minneapolis estimated uninsured small business losses at approximately $200 million on top of the city's official damage figures. That $200 million did not show up in the insurance industry's catastrophe report. It showed up in shuttered storefronts and empty parking lots. The long tail is worse. Research on the 1992 Los Angeles riots found that the affected neighborhoods lost $3.85 billion in taxable sales over the next decade that followed. Property values in riot-hit areas increased up to 30% less than comparable unaffected neighborhoods in the years following the unrest. The economic blast radius from a single week of civil disorder follows a community for a generation. That research exists. It's not obscure. Politicians just find it inconvenient to cite when they are explaining why they ordered the police to stand down. The legal framework is equally clear and equally buried. In 2021, the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy published a formal analysis with a direct conclusion. The government's failure to stop looting and rioting during the summer of 2020 is evidence that the Second Amendment is not a historical relic. It's a present-day operational necessity. The Supreme Court said in District of Columbia versus Heller that self-defense is the central component of the Second Amendment right. The CDC, not a gun rights organization, the Centers for Disease Control, documented that Americans use firearms defensively between 500,000 and 3 million times per year. The overwhelming majority of those incidents never involve a shot fired. The presence of the firearm ends the threat. The armed neighbors in Minneapolis and Kenosha were not anomalies. They were the Second Amendment working exactly as designed, filling the gap that government created and refused to close. So what does all of this look like through the only lens that cuts clean? Not Democrat, not Republican. Liberty versus control. That's where we go next. Let's call this what it is. Through the only lens that doesn't lie to you. When a mayor orders police to stand down during active looting, that is not a government failure. That's the government working exactly as designed, just not for you. Selective enforcement is not a malfunction of state power. It's a state power exercise based on political calculation. When officials decide which properties get protected and which ones burn, they've revealed something important. Law and order is not a service they provide equally. It's a tool they deploy strategically. And every riot that government fails to contain becomes a pretext for more authority afterwards, more federal surveillance, broader definitions of domestic terrorism, tighter restrictions on assembly and on arms. The chaos is the pretext. The power grab is the point. We saw it after January 6th. We saw it after the summer of 2020. The party label switched. The appetite for control did not. Now let's name which rights are actually being eroded here, because this isn't abstract. Property rights are the floor of a free society. You cannot have individual liberty without the right to own something, defend it, and pass it on. When the government won't protect your property from destruction and simultaneously moves to restrict your ability to defend yourself, it has attacked both pillars of ownership at once. You hold the title. You no longer hold the security. That's not ownership. That's a revocable permit. The non-aggression principle is simple. You do not initiate force against another person or their property. The neighbors on the rooftop in Minneapolis did not initiate anything. The arsonist did. Every media framework that treated this defender as the threat and the arsonist as the sympathetic figure did not invert that principle by accident. It was a deliberate editorial choice with a deliberate political outcome. Now here's the part that makes establishment conservatives uncomfortable, and I'm going to say it anyway, because this channel doesn't carry water for any particular party. After 2020, Republican-controlled legislatures in Florida, Oklahoma, and Iowa passed anti-riot legislation under the banner of law and order. Some of those bills granted civil immunity to drivers who hit protesters blocking roads. Others increased criminal penalties for unlawful assembly. On the surface, law and order. Look at the bill language closely. Several of those statutes defined riot broadly enough to apply to organized neighborhood defense groups. The same legislative session that used imagery of burning cities to campaign on safety produced laws that could be used against the neighbors who put out the fires. That's not liberty. That's the same centralized power wearing a different tie. And if you only call it out when the left does it, you're not a principled defender of individual rights. You're a partisan. The armed neighbor on that rooftop was not a threat to civil society. He was civil society, doing what free people have always done when the institutions built to protect them choose not to. And what those institutions are building right now, legally, quietly, deliberately, is the subject of the next 2 minutes. Pay close attention here. What I'm about to walk through is not speculation. It's a logical sequence that follows directly from conditions already in place. ACLED recorded nearly 20,000 demonstrations in the United States in 2025. That's the highest annual total since 2020. The underlying drivers: political polarization, institutional distrust, economic stress, are not resolving, they're compounding. The question isn't whether the next major civil unrest event occurs. The question is what legal architecture is waiting when it does. Here's Domino 1. The triggering event: a high-profile verdict, a contested election outcome, a viral arrest. Any one of those can produce 2020 conditions within 72 hours. Cities that reduced their police forces during the defund years have not recovered that capacity. Many major metros have fewer officers on active duty today than they did in May of 2020. The vacuum will be wider. The response will be slower. The window for neighborhood-level decisions will open faster. Here's Domino 2, and this one is the slow burn that should concern you the most. The legal trap is already under construction. The framing of armed civilian defenders as vigilantes is not just a media narrative. It's pre-legislation. It's the public opinion foundation being poured right now so that the statute can be built on top of it later. Several active federal proposals carry domestic terrorism language broad enough, deliberately broad enough, to apply to organized neighborhood defense groups. If that language becomes law, The organized, vetted, licensed patrol that protected Lake Street in Minneapolis could be prosecuted under the same statute written to address actual terrorists. And here's the precedent that makes that possible. In multiple jurisdictions during 2020, armed rioters who destroyed property walked away. Armed defenders who protected property got investigated. When a legal system prosecutes the defender and releases the aggressor, it hasn't malfunctioned. It's made a policy decision. The state decides who gets to use force. That precedent does not stay in one city. It does not stay in one state. It becomes the template. That is not a free country. That's managed helplessness, engineered at the policy level and enforced through selective prosecution. So here's what's actually in your control. And here is where it stops being a problem and starts being a plan. 2 things you can do right now, not eventually, right now. First, get legally fluent in your own state. That line between justified self-defense and a felony charge shifts at the state border. Stand your ground and duty to retreat are not interchangeable. Castle Doctrine protections vary in scope. Some states protect the use of force in defense of a third party. Others do not. You need to know exactly where you stand before a crisis gives you 3 seconds to make a decision under stress. Organizations like Legal Heat and the United States Concealed Carry Association publish free, state-by-state legal breakdowns. Read yours this week, not after the next news cycle breaks. Second, build the relationships before you need them. The difference between the Lake Street rooftop patrol and the Kenosha chaos were not firepower. It was relationships. The Minneapolis patrol worked because those people knew each other. They had vetted each other. They had a plan before the sirens started. Know your neighbor. Know who carries and who doesn't. Know who has medical training. Because in civil unrest scenarios, trauma care matters as much as anything else. A neighborhood with a plan and communication structure is exponentially harder to victimize than one that is improvising at 2 a.m. If this video reframed anything for you, share it with one person who still believes the official story. One person who thinks 2020 was handled responsibly. One person who has not yet done the math on what happens when the police stand down and your block has no plan. That is how information moves, not through an algorithm, but through one conversation at a time. And if you want more breakdowns like this one, you already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. The Second Amendment was not written for a history museum. It was written for exactly this. I'll see you next time. Bye.